parents, you're not paying your kids' cell phone bills. Did you hear me? You're not paying your kids' cell phone bills. I see a child acting in a certain way, and I look over at the parent, and the parent seems clueless to the fact that their child's behavior is, let's say, rebellious or socially awkward or inappropriate. There's no room for disobedience. So if you're told to jump, you say, how high? If you're told to clean your room, to put the dishes away, to stop hitting your brother, it's not a negotiation. I'm a truth teller, and I'm just going to tell you that if you're putting your kids in a public school, you're putting them in the lion's den.
Yeah.
And they're going to get bit eventually.
Welcome to the Leadership Now podcast with Dr. Aaron Rock, hosted on Beachhead Media and other podcasting platforms. Aaron has served as a pastor, a chaplain, a professor, a writer, and a speaker, and he has a keen interest in helping other Christians to think Christianly about all of life. So on this show, we talk about the nuts and bolts of theology, church life, cultural issues, apologetics, ethics, and other relevant matters that will help you to lead better now. I'm your host, Chris Yeoman, and today we are going to continue in our relationship series, and today we're going to be talking about the parent-child relationship. We talked about the husband-wife relationship last week, and so this is a natural continuation of it. Before you tune into an episode, though, about parenting advice, you probably want to know if the person that you're listening to has any experience in parenting. So Aaron has ample experience with 5 children of his own, as well as being a grandpa, as well as having many years, 31 years of pastoral ministry experience. And so when he suggests some things and gives some advice, he knows what he's talking about from both the wins and the losses of the years. Now, there's obviously many aspects we can talk about parenting. We were just chatting before the show started about diaper changing strategies. It can go from everything from that. We aren't going to talk about diaper changing strategies, but
although we both changed plenty. Just so people know, we have some experience in that area.
Exactly. It's not just a woman's job, but you talk about diaper changing, feeding, teaching, disciplining, all of those things. And so we're going to talk about some of those other aspects. So to divide our teaching time or speaking time, we're going to divide into 2 categories. One, talking about parenting minors, children under 18, and then also being a parent of adult children. So Aaron, maybe you can start with just why this is such an important topic.
Mm-hmm. I love discussing this because I think our children are so important to us, and not just as parents, but the next generation is so important to conscientious Christian adults. I want to see other parents succeed in raising godly children for Christ. Obviously, I have a vested interest in my own kids and grandchildren, but I want to see your children become outstanding warriors for Christ. I want to see the people in our church flourish. So in no way, shape, or form during this podcast, if I touch on an issue that you have failed in, is my intention to speak down to you. It's necessary for us to sometimes be convicted or confronted for our failures, but what we really want to do is take full responsibility for today and for the days to come. So this is a really important subject. As we look out at our broader culture, there's a lot of disturbing trends. If you go on Twitter, there's often videos posted of fights that have broken out in classrooms, like horrendous fights, girls fighting girls, like violently. I saw a video last week of a bunch of girls attacking a younger girl in a bathroom stall who was in a wheelchair and throwing her around the stall, a disabled child. I saw a video of a teenage boy walk up while his classmates were filming it and just give like a full windmill smack to his middle-aged female teacher across the face. This is the kind of thing that's symptomatic of a culture that's lost its way. And while we can't fix all these issues overnight, we need to take responsibility as Christian parents to make sure that we're doing our best to create godly, conscientious students. It's Christ or chaos, folks. That's really what it all boils down to. It's Christ or chaos. And the proof's in the pudding. We're seeing in our culture, the less Christ, the more chaos. Well, that shouldn't be true in the Christian church. We want our children to be marked by Christ's likeness, and there's plenty of biblical evidence that God has entrusted parents with the high calling of raising their children for Christ, and we're equipped to do so. I'm also meeting a lot of parents that are discouraged as they see their children go a little bit wayward, so we want to encourage them. We have lots and lots of stories of children that have abandoned the Christian faith or fallen into some of the false ideologies and philosophies, the deceptive philosophies of the world within which we live. There's cultural assaults on the family. I mean, the state within which we live is not pro-family. They're pro-nonsense. They're always promoting every new fad, but not the nuclear biblical family. It's transgenderism, it's gay pride, it's chopping parts off, it's single parent families, it's abortion, on and on and on, funding it, encouraging it, promoting it, passing laws where you can't speak against this sort of thing. But who's actually investing in stable moms and dads raising stable children? We're not seeing that. So there's an assault from our culture on the family. And I guess the main reason why we would want to have a discussion about this is because it's part of the Dominion mandate. It's part of our creational mandate. We are called to be fruitful and multiply. And if you are married and if you are capable of multiplying and you have a stewardship. And God has given that to you, and you need to take conscientious responsibility for that. Not be passive, not be all uptight about it either, but not be passive, be thoughtful. And there's some good tactics that you can employ that will help you to up your game and bear fruit. And have, at the end of the day, be able to sit back and say, when your kids hit adulthood, it worked. I was successful by God's grace. That's what we want people to be able to experience.
Mm-hmm. And interestingly, as a parent, I know there's no manual out there that writes in detail every single, what the routine should be and how you should do stuff, right? There's biblical principles, but then there is wisdom from lived experience. So Aaron, what would be some practical advice that you would give some of the key pieces for parents that are raising children to adulthood?
So the most fundamental piece of advice I could give for a parent who wants to raise children successfully is to make sure they themselves are close to Christ. You cannot lead anyone, much less your children, if you're not being led by Christ. So Christ leads us into truth and wisdom and knowledge. So making sure that we have shored up our walk with Christ. We're never going to be perfect this side of heaven, but making sure that we are conscientiously in the Word, availing ourselves of the spiritual disciplines, quickly repenting of our sins, accountable in relationships, robustly involved in the life of a faithful church. If we don't have these things going on, prayer for ourselves, for our children, we will fail. Mm-hmm. No matter how, you could have 5 degrees in child psychiatry, child psychology, ECE, you could be a public school, elementary teacher, whatever. You could have lots of training, you could have books. But if you're not close to the Lord, you will fail. Second thing is stay close to your spouse. So the marital relationship is one of the greatest sermons, living sermons your children will ever see. As they watch and observe mom and dad in relationship to one another, that helps them to see what covenantal love looks like. That helps them to see what forgiveness looks like. That helps them to see how two fallen creatures can redeem what has been marred by sin. That helps them to see Christ and the church being role played in the husband-wife relationship. That helps them to understand healthy creational sexuality in action, affection, forgiveness. So many lessons can be learned just from observing your parents. Even if nothing is said, there's a place to say things, but even if nothing is said, I think a couple's greatest gift to their children is a stable relationship. And if you can fake it till you make it, but your children will pick up on that. In your home, you can only hide for so long. Children will slowly pick up on the dynamics. They may not even be able to put them into words, but they'll pick up on the dynamics. If the role relationships are out of sync, mom's acting like dad and dad's acting like mom, they'll pick up on tension or stress or lack of forgiveness or distance in terms of intimacy. Obviously, you're not having intercourse in front of your kids, but at the same time, it's a mistake never to show affection to your spouse in front of your children. Even if they're like, ew, yuck, that's a good thing. They need to see that creational sexuality is not a dirty thing. It's not something we hide. It's not something, we pretend we don't have sex. No, we do. And we don't pretend that we're in love with one another. Appropriate displays of physical affection are things that children should see. And if you were raised in a home where you never saw that, and your parents, hit the reset button and make sure that your children see all of those dynamics to marriage in action: male headship, female submission. All those dynamics are really, really important for a child to observe in their mom and their dad. So those two first pieces of advice, Chris, don't relate directly to like how to parent your child. Like what are the tactics? What are the things to do, say? But they set the basis. They set the environment, the culture, if you will, of the household. And if you're in a situation where daddy's left or mommy's left, or maybe one of your parents has died, okay, we get it. Like there's all sorts of messiness in a broken world. But we're talking about the ideal. And if you're in a less than ideal relationship or a set of circumstances, well, make the best of that in light of, what God has permitted you to go through.
Yeah, and God's grace extends to those situations, right? So it's not like it's a recipe where if there's not a two-parent home, the kids are going to be failures, clearly,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah. So we need God. We have a high view of God's sovereignty, and we need God to do what God can't do. But instead of worrying about what God is doing or presuming about what God is going to do, let's create a culture where we take responsibility for our end of the bargain. All right?
That's good.
So those things having been said, let's get into some very practical things that good parents will put into practice. And one of the first things that comes to mind is to study your child. The Bible talks about training up a child in the way he should go, meaning according to his bent, and when he's old, he will not depart. That implies that a conscientious parent observes and studies their child. Now, you may not be in a career where you're called upon to regularly assess people, to study people's behavior. Some of you are in human resources. Some of you may be in psychology, or you may be a school teacher, or you may be a counselor or whatnot. And so it's natural for you to be studying and assessing people. Others of you are putting walls up, you're building cars on an assembly line, you're plumbing in a house, you're pulling wires, you're tilling a field. And so you don't spend the majority of your time assessing people. You're hands-on. But when it comes to family life, it's important for us to learn that skill, to observe our children. So when you tease a child or you tell a joke to a child, you should be observing how's that child responding to that? What are the limits of their maybe sense of humor? What are their sensitivities? When you are disciplining a child, you will intuitively adjust your discipline to the personality of that child. Obviously there's a difference between, let's say, how a father like myself would have disciplined or corrected his daughters as opposed to his sons, and I have some of each. But even then, among my sons or between my daughters, there's slight adjustments that you make because you know that maybe one child has a greater bandwidth for criticism, another is very sensitive, another is maybe a bit more resistant. Maybe you have a child that's quicker on the draw, like they pick up on things. As soon as you start disciplining them, they're already convicted and they've already repented. Others, you got to kind of draw it out of them. So I think it's important for parents, especially if you have more than one child, to study each child. And I'm not talking about overthinking things necessarily or making it overcomplicated, but just learn the art of watching when a child becomes dejected or encouraged, when they're inquisitive, when there's spiritual sensitivity, when they're distancing themselves from you. And then when you see that in a child, you lean in and you adjust your response. Just like if I'm chatting with you, I've known you for probably 15 years, and we've worked together in this church for at least 12. So I've known you for a lengthy period of time. I know your personality, I know your educational background, your family life. So I'm going to adjust my approach to you. I'm going to approach you differently than someone that I just met last week, who, let's say, is a female. Or I'm going to adjust my approach to a 25-year-old guy in the church as opposed to a 75-year-old guy in the church. I'm going to adjust my approach to someone who grew up in Canada as opposed to someone that just, got off the plane and immigrated here last week. So we're always adjusting in relationships, but I think sometimes parents make the mistake of parenting all their kids exactly the same, and they're not paying attention to the signs, the cues, the clues, if you will, that a child is maybe feeling dejected or they're demonstrating a rebellious spirit. And this applies like right from the get-go. So I we're kind of back into that fun stage where we have the grandbabies now, and it's bringing back a lot of memories. And you're starting to see personality, you're starting to see attitude, you're starting to see, maleness and femaleness being demonstrated in those little guys. And I'm observing that. Like I'm paying attention for signs of maybe rebellion or assertiveness or femininity or masculinity or inquisitiveness or not paying attention. Like I'm starting to observe those things in these little grandbabies that they're not they're my children's children, but we have access to them and we take care of them and we're privileged to be able to do that. So it starts when they're very, very little. Mm-hmm. You see a little bit of a rebellious streak, in a little toddler, and you need to figure out how to address that. If you see they're always looking the other direction, or they're staring you down, or whatever it might be, you're paying attention to those things and you're adjusting your parental tactics to them. And this helps you to, over time, identify and accentuate their strengths. And it also helps you to see how they can use those strengths for the Lord. Mm-hmm. So start to guide them and direct, not into a specific career. Okay, you're 18 months. I know what you're going to do for a living. Not that, but you start to see a certain bent in a child from the time they're young, and then it also allows you to nip negative behavior in the bud. Mm. And I want to emphasize this, how important it is for parents to do this, because I think very few parents actually do this. Mm-hmm. Like I see, even in our own church, I see a child acting in a certain way, and I look over at the parent, and the parent seems clueless to the fact that their child's behavior is, let's say, rebellious or socially awkward or like inappropriate in a certain context, or a child is reserved and withdrawing from others, and they don't seem to be helping them through that, or they maybe lack boundaries in terms of the way they approach adults. Like sometimes kids in our church approach me inappropriately. Mm-hmm. One way would be they come up and they'll call me Aaron. That's not appropriate. Yep. I am a middle-aged man. A 6-year-old should never be allowed to come up to me and call me Aaron. I'm Mr. Rock to you until you hit adulthood. And for a parent not to pick up on that social cue, I find is a little bit odd. Or sometimes I'll have a child come up to me and they'll start talking to me, and I don't understand what they're saying. And it's not because they're a little child, but they've not been trained to maybe slow down and speak slowly or speak more clearly. Mm-hmm. The parent doesn't seem to be dealing with maybe that speech or that communication issue. Or a child will just run by and be like, hey, you guys slow down. And they don't even bother looking. They just keep going. Yep. Like somewhere along the line, that child is being taught that it's okay not to listen to adults. So those are things, and there's many, I'm not suggesting this is the majority, but sometimes you see those little things and it automatically makes me think, okay, how is the parent not addressing this issue? Mm-hmm. So if your kids fall into those categories, again, I'm not trying to speak down to you or make you feel bad, but you need to up your game in the area of studying your child and paying attention to their behavioral patterns.
Yeah. Do you wonder, have any insight as to why parents resist confronting that behavior in their children?
Insecurity, I think, is one of them. Parents, and by the way, this would be another piece of advice. Don't compare your kids to other kids. Mm. Like we do in a certain level because we're all socially being adjusted. But if you're the kind of parent where when an issue is pointed out in your child, you immediately defend your child because you take it personally and who do you think you are? Look, you should be listening to advice from people like me. Mm-hmm. I have successfully raised 5 kids that are all Christian adults. And that's not, some people will say, well, that's kind of a little bit arrogant to say that. It's a fact. I'm a truth teller. It's a fact. So just like I would always look to parents that were ahead of me, and I'm like, okay, I want to identify the parents that have a good quote unquote product. They've created a child, they've developed a child, they've disciplined a child that, like, I kind of would want my kids to be like that. I look to them. So look to parents that are doing a good job or have done a good job. Every generation should pass on those lessons to the next. But I think some parents fail because they're insecure, and they can't think objectively about their kid. Like their default is, I got to protect little, the proverbial Johnny or Susie, right? And we have to be careful of that. Some are just tired and passive. They don't actually love their child enough to discipline them. Some have passed the buck off to the church. They just assume, well, the church is going to do it, or the proverbial youth pastor is going to fix the problem. So all bad reasons. But I would say, again, to categorize, I think there's often insecurity, and there's often an attempt to resist any suggestion that, my child should be acting more like your child, or my child should be acting more like his child. And then like a passivity, which is ultimately a lack of love.
Yeah. Once in a while, I find as well, maybe this is my context, what I've seen anyways, is that there are some, if you have a parent that struggles socially, they might not be able to see in their child what the issue is. So it's almost like you can't see your own blind spots, and so your kids replicate them. So which is the advantage of having a community speaking into your kids' behavior.
Yeah, and I would like to address that in a little bit, because one of my gut feelings is that sometimes people even homeschool their children not based upon a principle that says, we want to take full responsibility for the outcomes of our child, or we really want to be proactively involved, but rather they're protecting their child from social relationships that they themselves feel or felt awkward in.
Yep.
And so if you are a person that struggles in relationships socially, and you become aware of that, you need to kind of take your kids down a different path instead of. There's a difference between protecting your child from all the nonsense and sin of the world within limits. I mean, we're in the world, but not of it.
Yep.
And putting your kids in a situation where they literally don't even know how to relate to other people, because you're
right?
Hyper protective. It's actually a bit of idolatry there when you are trying to be so protective over your child, so that they're never exposed to any problems, they're never exposed to any evil. It's almost like you're playing the role of God. So we have to factor in God's grace in all of this. Like, all of us in a sinful world will be exposed to garbage, nonsense, sin, temptation. You will never be able to protect your kids from that.
Yep.
But you can help equip them to deal with those issues, right? So this brings us to a couple other points I want to make right at the onset. One is address their weaknesses objectively. And I'm not even talking about sin issues necessarily, but you're not doing your child any favors by failing to help them to see what their strengths and their weaknesses are, what their natural propensities are. So if you have a child that has proven him or herself to just not have any athletic prowess, stop telling them they're going to make the NHL, right? Stop pushing them in a direction that's not how they're wired. If you have a child that's of average intelligence, which is the vast majority of us, and that child's like, oh, I want to be a rocket scientist. Like, of course, children can develop. It's hard maybe to assess in a 6-year-old. By 16, you'll know, right? But it's okay to acknowledge, hey, you're not necessarily going to say it this way, but it's okay to acknowledge you may have a child with average intelligence, above average intelligence, a child that may be quick-witted, a child that may be a little slower on the uptake, to direct them into a career or a vocation that's suitable to them, rather than pushing them in a direction that's not suitable to their makeup. Mm-hmm. And then they become disappointed with that. Or if you, have a child that maybe, I have 5 kids. So if I were to think about it long enough, I could probably categorize them in terms of verbal skills. And then I could categorize them in terms of athletic skills, and then kinesthetic abilities, and wisdom issues, and problem solving and conflict. There's all these different categories in life, and I could say, okay, yeah, this child is sort of the head of the pack here. This child's the head of the pack here, and it's not the same person, right? They have different gift mixes, and I want to kind of guide them in direct them in light of how God has wired them. So instead of just too many parents, it's like, well, just go through school. Don't specialize in anything or specialize in everything, and then just wander around in university for 5 or 6 years, and then go over to college and wander around there for a few years, and just start earning certificates and degrees, and just start working here and there. And maybe when you're 30, you'll finally have direction in life. Like, that's just sad.
It is, because the parent has the opportunity to see them for many years when they don't even see themselves and see what they can't see in themselves until later, right?
Even with regard to Christian ministry, I'm in pastoral ministry. I never said to my kids, I want you to all go into Christian, like vocational public ministry. I have a son that's in full-time vocational ministry, and in grade 12, I kind of took him aside and I said, I think maybe that's something for you to consider. Like, I'm just seeing things in you. My other sons are in the trades, and I champion that. It's not better or worse; it's just different, right? And so I think don't make your kids try to guess what their strengths and weaknesses are. Help them to see it, and affirming your strengths and being aware of your weaknesses is not a downer, but there's just certain things I can't do. I'm just not wired for, and I'm totally fine with that. And there's other things that I'm wired for and I'm efficient at. So why would I not? My greatest benefit to the kingdom of God and society is to use my strengths, not to try to create strengths out of weaknesses or incompetencies. And then, of course, on a moral level, addressing sin proactively. So if your child is, late teens or young adult and they're off the rails, the question I would have is, how many things did you overlook to allow them to get there along the way? Like, you're obviously not responsible for your child's moral choices once they leave the house, but you have control. I want to remind parents, you have control, and that's a positive word. You have control, you have authority, you have leverage over your children right up to the time they leave the home, and use that. Like, don't allow a child to mouth off to you. That's not the kind of, my child's kind of mouthy. No, my child were never mouthy because I just didn't tolerate it. Kids can be resentful. They can reject your advice, but take responsibility. So if you see a child coming in the house, walking by you saying, ugh, just walking up to their room and spending the night in their room playing on their phone, you have to throw up your hands and say, oh, I don't know what to do. That child, they don't communicate well. Really? Like, you're an adult. You're going to be that dejected? You knock on the door, you say, we need to have a conversation about this. And you don't do it when they've done that 80 times. You do it like the second or third time when it's becoming a pattern. Yep. You deal with that right away. You say, look, in our home, we're not going to create a household or an environment where kids are hanging out in their room all night playing on the phone. That's just not going to be permitted here. That's not going to go over well. So I want you out and about with your brothers, your sisters, your mom, your dad. You're going to be at the dinner table. There's no arguing. There's no negotiating. That's a rule, and I expect you to respect that. And you don't necessarily even go to the thing of, or there's going to be consequences unless you get some pushback. Yep. But if they push back, excuse me? Like, I'm not going to take that kind of attitude. That's not going to go over well for you. Like, unless you want to walk to school, or unless you want to spend the summer in your bedroom with, no opportunity for vacation, no opportunity for socializing, that's not going to go over well in this household. You don't need to flip out. You tell them objectively, here's the rules, right? Yep. And you're doing your kids a favor. It makes parenting a whole lot less stressful too when you just address sin proactively. Would you say it's true that if you address sin early on, it's easier later on? Oh, totally. Okay. The hardest years are the children years, not the teenage years. If you're a Christian parent, unless you come to faith later, if you're a Christian parent and you have teenagers that are off the rails, it's because you flubbed the child years. The teenage years should be relatively stress-free. There's always going to be issues, but that's the final few laps before they get to adulthood. So if you have disciplined them and proven yourself to be a person of respect or a person of love to your children in those early years when they're emotional control nuts, the thing you got to concern yourself the most with in teenagers is sexuality, because that's when their sexuality is really kicking in, and the hormones are flying, and they're interested in the opposite sex and these sorts of things. There's exposure to temptation. That's kind of the biggie for most parents that you got to deal with. But you shouldn't be. By the time they're teenagers, there should be no discussion about what family boundaries are. like how you're allowed to address mom or dad, that shouldn't be something that even comes up in the teen years. You establish that when they were young. Expectations in terms of how you help around the house or participation in the life of the church. If you're having those conversations with your teenager, you're several years too late. So have them with the kids, and then by the time they're teenagers and they're starting to show more independence, which you're not going to buck that. I mean, you want them to become somewhat independent, or maybe a better way of putting it is interdependent.
Right.
But be very proactive in the early years, and then you can start to throttle back a little bit as they enter into those final few laps.
Mm-hmm. What I've experienced so far, and I'm not as far obviously along in the journey of parenting because our oldest is 11. So it's interesting when you develop a sense of good character and responsibility. They get to do things early, and they take great pride in the ability to do that, those things early, or to be able to have responsibility. And it fuels itself, right? Because they're rewarded, and then they love that obedience brings rewards and blessing. And
I don't really know of too many kids that don't want to be treated as a little bit older than they are. And I guess the way you parent your child would be in such a way that you communicate to them, look, if you prove yourself to be faithful and conscientious in this area, you're actually going to get a lot more freedom. So teenagers love freedom. Mm-hmm. Well, I guess what I would have communicated to my kids is, I love the fact that you would have freedom too. I want to give you freedom. Like, I want you to get your driver's license. I want you to feel free to make good decisions about what time you come home at night. I want to trust you in your relationships. I want to trust you around technology. But that trust that I'm going to give to you is predicated upon obedience in those earlier years, right? And if you prove yourself to be responsible, to be on the ball, to be faithful to the Lord and obedient to your parents, it's actually going to work out to your benefit. You're going to have more freedom. It's the same in church life. The more compliant, the more willing to serve, the more humble, the more submissive congregants and young church leaders are at the beginning, the more freedom and opportunity they have to serve and to make decisions. But if you're always the kind of person that has to be monitored, that has to be followed up on, that has to be talked to, that has to be disciplined, after a while, it's just exhausting, right? So in leadership here at our church, when I bring staff on, my perspective has always been, if they prove themselves to be faithful, they're going to have almost a free hand. Mm-hmm. There's still boundaries, but they're going to have a free hand. But if I have to ask you to do something, you don't do it, and I have to ask again, you don't do it, then we're going to be breathing down your neck, mm-hmm. right? Because certain things have to be done. So if you want freedom, be responsible.
That's right.
And communicate that to your kids. If you want freedom and liberty, don't be a knucklehead. Like, listen to your mom and dad, be respectful, do what you're told, and you're going to be told a lot fewer things very shortly, right? The other thing I would say, kind of jumping off of the springboarding off of addressing sin proactively, is never, ever facilitate sinful behavior. Don't facilitate it. Like, don't facilitate it in any way, shape, or form. Don't ever be the parent that just shrugs their shoulder, throws up their hands, says, oh, well, it is what it is. Don't facilitate sinful relationships, for example. Oh, my son, my daughter who's a Christian just brought home a non-Christian boyfriend or girlfriend. Oh, well, I'll just invite him to sit down at the dinner table. What am I going to do about it? No, it's not going to happen. Absolutely not. It's out of bounds. I don't want to go to youth group. Too bad, you're going. It's not even a conversation. I don't want to get up for school. Tough luck, you're going anyway. Like, you don't accommodate or facilitate or bow or buckle to that. But sometimes parents that have had children later in life that are just maybe too chill, or that want to be their kid's friend. Okay, you'll become your child's friend when they're an adult if you've done a good job when they're young. But your job is not to be your kid's friend. Okay, you don't need to concern yourself with your kids liking you. It shouldn't even be on your mind. Whether my kids like me or not when they're little is completely irrelevant, right? My job is to love them, discipline them, train them up in the fear and admonition of the Lord. Same in the life of the church. if I'm a pastor that's going to take responsibility for my congregation, I'm not going to be jerked back and forth depending on people's whims or, desires or suggestions. I'm going to be listening to and observing my congregation, but ultimately, along with the rest of the elders in the church, I'm going to make decisions that I think are in keeping with our mission, our doctrine, our vision, and you either follow or you're going to fall off the bus. Like it's not going to be a democracy in the life of the church where everyone is pulling the church in a different direction. And it's because I'm an adult and have a lot of adult friends in the church, but my dominant desire is not to be your friend. It's to be your pastor. And as I pastor you, chances are friendships are going to develop, but I'm not going to be coerced by some desire to be everyone's friend that will put me in a position where I may compromise my values. And I think a lot of pastors and a lot of parents and a lot of people in leadership, they're people pleasers. They're just desperate for affection or attention or something. And if you are in an awkward relationship, so let's say you're a mom and your husband's a bit of a tool. It's very common, or I should say you're a wife and your husband's a bit of a tool. It's very common then if that relationship is in shambles for the mom to almost like pick one of the children to be like the surrogate spouse. I'm not talking about it in a sexual way, but in an emotional way, where she begins to rely upon a son or a daughter. They become like best friends, and it creates this weird relationship where the dad's sort of the fifth wheel, and there's some sort of an over-reliance upon the children to make the family work. And I experienced that in my own family of origin growing up because my dad left and I was the oldest son. So I was sort of prematurely forced into a position where I was making decisions that I wasn't mature enough for, I wasn't equipped for. Or you're in a situation where maybe there's a husband and he loves the Lord, but his wife's kind of off the rails. And so he relies upon maybe his kids to pass messages on to his wife, or he plays favorites with his daughter or sons almost to try to get the attention of his wife back. So there's all sorts of dynamics there that we need to be aware of that are very complicated to handle and to juggle, I guess you could say. It's better just to follow God's basic plans. Husband and wife, loving the Lord, disciplining their children, addressing issues, not facilitating negative behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What would you say? I know you mentioned something about curfews or times coming home in previous episodes, being dogmatic about some people get really worked up about stuff that they probably shouldn't get worked up. So maybe to that end of things.
Yeah, I think we should be dogmatic about a very limited number of things and pretty flexible on the majority of things, which is what we would want to see in a conscientious Christian adult as well. So when it comes to parenting, my advice is pick your battles and make sure those battles are God's battles. So there's one of those battles would be there's no room for disrespecting your parents. So no behavior will ever be tolerated in the house where there's disrespect directed from a child to their mother or their father, and parents need to stand together on that. Mm-hmm. There's no room for disobedience. So if you're told to jump, you say, how high, right? If you're told to clean your room, to put the dishes away, to stop hitting your brother, to go to school, to get dressed, to mow the grass, whatever, there's no, it's not a negotiation. Mm-hmm. And it's not like you're yelling at the person, but it's more of like this. It's like, hey guys, please put your dishes away. And they just get up and do it. Mm-hmm. It doesn't need to be like weird or a confrontation or stressful. Hey, Josiah, it's your turn to cut the grass. Go cut the grass. Okay, yeah, go cut the grass. Like, it doesn't need to be an argument. Mm-hmm. You just do it, right? So there's obedience. We're going to church. Oh, I don't like the youth group. We're not even having that conversation. You're going to church. Oh, mm-hmm. The youth pastor offended me. Don't care. You're going to church. Oh, no one likes me. We're not even having that conversation. Like, you're going to church. You're going to go, and you're going to be Christ to your youth group. You're going to be Christ-like to your youth pastor. Mm-hmm. You're going to go, and you're going to be the kid that's going to look for the awkward kid or the new kid to befriend them. You're not going to go because, that's your social circle. Right. If you send your kid to youth group and your goal is, well, I want my kid to be socialized, I want my kid to fit in. Well, right away, you're creating a consumer child. So I often would say to my kids, like, if I ever find out that you're at youth group and you're just hanging out with your little clique and you're not being hospitable to the proverbial stranger, I'm going to feel upset about that. And there were times when they did fall into that behavior. I know they did. And so I would have a little conversation. I would say, hey, because sometimes they're all in youth group together. I'm kind of hearing from your brother or your sister that you're in your little clique, and I want you to be the person that goes and meets the stranger, right? Yeah. So right away, you're sort of teaching them to serve rather than be served. So those things, there's no flexibility on. Now, in terms of, and then obviously doing your best within reason in all areas of life, but where I think parents sometimes err is, for example, they assess their child's development based more on their report card than the 10 Commandments. It's like they're just so fixated on grades. They're so fixated on marks. They're so fixated on school. Well, you want your kid to do well in that area, but I interact with thousands of adults in my adult years, and very rarely do their grades have a whole lot to do with where they're at in life. What you're looking for is someone that tried hard. So grades, it's just not something to break relationship with your kids about. And even in saying that, I bet there's a lot of people listening that they're like, whoa, like that's going to take some mental adjustment for me, because that's just the way I think.
100%.
Another area would be like curfews. I mean, our rule was you got a curfew and you break it. What's the curfew? Well, we'll decide it when you break it. Like if you're being unreasonable and you're home at a time that just doesn't make sense, then I'm going to start putting curfews on. But if you're home at a time that's reasonable, if my wife goes out shopping or whatever, I don't say, you need to be home by 2 p.m. I would assume within reason it's going to be within a 1 or 2 hour window. If I was sort of assuming that it was going to be around 2 and she's not home by 5, there's probably going to be some calling and texting taking place. But otherwise, I don't really care. Like whatever, I trust my wife. Like if you need an extra 30 minutes to shop, whatever.
Yep.
And the same with your child, depending on when the youth group ends or some, event ends or whatever. In terms of like dress style, come on, people. Like there's not like one style that you need to impose upon your child. The principles are, I don't want to see the girls dressed immodestly. And wasn't an issue with my boys, but maybe when they're younger, like put some underwear on, dude, before you go out. Dressed half decently. But I see parents sometimes, like if every time I see your child, their hair is like perfectly combed and they're wearing designer clothing, and then you got the matching Instagram pictures or Facebook pictures where you're all lined up and, the sun is just setting right. And like you're always trying to present your family as perfect. I would just say, we all know you are a poser.
Yep.
You're a poser. And let me just speak a word to the next generation. I'm going to speak a word to the women in the next generation. It's usually my wife that does this, but I'm going to do this now because it just comes to my mind. There's nothing wrong with a nice family photo. There's nothing wrong with your children looking nice for school or for church or whatever. But if you're spending countless hours on Instagram or Facebook or social media and you see all these glamour families, they're wearing they got the plaid shirts on, they're posed against the barn, even though they don't live on a farm, they're posed against the barn. The mom's got the broad brim cool hat on with her hair all in flowing locks. The dad's got the neatly trimmed beard, the rolled up jeans. The kids are all cute and good looking. There's the dog there that, never barks and never poops, never eats the kids' toys and everything else. And just the ideal family. You are a poser family. We know you are. Like you can fake it, but you'll never make it. So show some realism. Like there's nothing wrong with a nice photo. I'm not saying that. Like it's artistic. It's a nice way of, for a Christmas card or family photos to do that. But we always have to check our spirit. Like, are we trying to show off? Are we trying to present ourselves in a way that's unauthentic? And there's a huge pressure. I know this. There's huge pressure on young families today, even in the Christian community, to comply with some stereotypical notion of what the ideal Christian family looks like. And I think we need to repudiate that and reject that and focus more on the internal values rather than those externals. So the more time you spend on developing character and virtue in your children, instead of focusing on the externals, the better product that you're going to get. Like I would rather see an average looking family, or maybe even a bit of a homely looking family, who absolutely loves the Lord Jesus Christ and is committed to the things of God and builds the kingdom of God and loves Christ and has joy and beauty written in their countenance, than hollow fake mannequins that are trying to parrot some sort of a social paradigm for the ideal family, but really are devoid of character and devoid of any real substance. And so that's a word of, hopefully a word of redemptive offense
That's good.
to those that may be listening in. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about is the future. So I think it's important for us to verbalize to our children our preferred future for them. Another way of saying that is, I want to let my kids know what I want them to turn out like. Not in all the specifics and details, but in the big categories. So I remember saying to my kids when they were young, more than anything else, I just want you to be sold out followers of the Lord Jesus Christ. I obviously want you to get decent jobs and all that kind of stuff, but I'm not going to be ashamed of you if you have some low earning job I remember saying to them, I would rather you be working at a convenience store all of your life, which probably isn't the greatest analogy today because they just basically sell death, candy, smokes, weed, porn, But the point I wanted to make is, I'd rather you just be, I'll use an ice cream stand. I'd rather you be working at an ice cream stand, but be absolutely sold out to the Lord Jesus Christ and have some high-paying job as a CEO of a company or whatever, and just be like a hollow or mediocre Christian. I don't want that for you. So when you say that to a child, that immediately shapes their expectations, or they understand your expectations for them. So I'm just going to ask the parents, listen to this. Have you verbalized your preferred future for your child? Have you said that to them in those words? This is what I want out of you. A daughter, the son. These are the things that really, really matter, right? And we don't need to list all those things because they're the things of the Bible, like virtue, character, service, contributing to God's kingdom, taking dominion. These are the things that matter the most. Whether you pull in the car into the parking or into the driveway in a car with, rotted out doors or a sports car, it doesn't really matter to me. I'm not impressed by those things. Whether you have 6 kids or 2 kids, those are not things that we need to concern ourselves with. Are you fully committed to the things of God? And that's what matters the most. And we live in a culture, Chris, that emphasizes externals so much. And then Christians come to church and we're just about the internals. Well, are you really? Are you really? Are you really raising your child in the fear and admonition of the Lord? Are you more concerned about whether the kids in the youth group will like them, or whether the jock or the head cheerleader at the school will take an interest in your child, right? So we need to be careful about these things and verbalize, I should say, our preferred future for our children instead of assuming that they know what our expectations of them are.
Yeah. I know many people have trouble verbalizing a preferred future for themselves, thinking about what the future holds other than...
I agree.
And so how would a person go about developing that?
Well, you have to have a Christian worldview. So it means you got to be sitting under the preaching and teaching of the word, reading the word of God. You have to have your priorities in line. And you have to understand, for example, I'll give you the most fundamental one. The mission of God is the glory of God. We say that all the time. You catechize people, you indoctrinate people, you drive that home. The mission of God is the glory of God. Well, I thought God was here sort of to make my life better. Well, he does make our lives better, but actually he predates you. And he is sovereign and he is the original one. So understanding that every decision in life has to somehow connect back to God's glory. And if it doesn't, it's not a good decision. So if you can't think about how does your career somehow connect to God's glory? How do your schooling choices, your financial expenditures, your church service, your career, what vehicle you buy, what vacations you go on, what animals you own, like how does this connect? What's the link between your decisions and God's glory being manifest through your life? Think about that. So that's important. Now, when it comes to a preferred future, like it doesn't mean that you have to know what your career is going to be or what who you're going to marry or what city you're going to live in or these kinds of what kind of house you're going to buy or when you're going to buy it. But I remember as a younger person, it could have been through some mission conferences, preaching, Sunday school teaching, probably a combination of things, not having a great deal of clarity on what my career would be, but sensing deep within my soul, I wanted to do something that would impact people's lives for Christ. Like I wanted to use my life, however long God had me here, to lead people to a saving knowledge of Christ and help them to grow in the Christian faith. And the reason why I was so passionate about that is because that was my greatest gift from God. I received salvation. I was blessed by that. And so I said this to some of our folks before, like I had no thought. I don't even think I spent a quarter of a second before I was about 17 thinking about pastoral ministry. Like it wasn't even on my radar. Never considered it in any way, shape, or form. And 30 years later, here's what I'm doing. But what I didn't know this was the vehicle that God would use to allow me to contribute to his kingdom. But my preferred future is I don't want to waste my life.
Yep.
I don't want to, whether I'm in plumbing, which was my original direction I was headed in, or some other field, I did not want to waste my life just getting up, having breakfast, going to work, coming home, spending my money, not sharing my faith, not participating in a church, and then getting old and dying. I did not want that. But a lot of people get sidetracked by the daily schedule, the daily routine, the daily responsibilities, and they lose sight of like, why are you here? How is your life benefiting God's kingdom and bringing glory to God? How are you benefiting other people's lives? See, we're so selfish. And selfishness is often expressed most commonly in thoughtlessness. I don't think about tomorrow. I don't think about next week because I'm just living in the moment. I'm just thinking about, what time's the next coffee break? Or when do I get off work? Or what are the prices of gas or whatever? Like just meaningless things.
Yeah.
Instead of realizing like our lives, and these words aren't original to me, but our lives are like a moment of time wedged between two eternities. I think it was Richard Mouw that said that. Our lives are like a moment of time wedged between two eternities. What are you going to do with it? What are you going to do with that little wedge? Because what you do with that little wedge affects eternity to come. And so we have to have a red hot passion not for fame. I long for obscurity more days than not. But if God puts you in a public ministry like mine, then leverage it for his honor and for his glory. And communicate that to your child. And then when they're serving the Lord, say, I'm proud of them. I'm proud that my kids serve in ministry, in the church and in their careers. I'm proud of them for doing that. And if they listen to this podcast, I want you to know again, Josiah, Casey, Levi, Simon, and Abby, and my wonderful daughter-in-laws, Rachel, Tasha, Julia, my great son-in-law, Daniel. I love you, and I'm proud that you are using your lives for Christ. We need to tell kids that and help them to see that's what really matters.
Yep.
I don't care if you're the coolest kid in in the squad, or you have the highest paying job. There's no comparisons, but where we would want to compare our kids is, are they serving the Lord? Are they focused on these things?
Yeah.
So if a parent doesn't understand that, how on earth are the kids going to get it unless God brings someone else in their lives to give it to them?
100%. Yeah. Again, what those things you call out that become the spoken values of your home, right?
It's true in our church too, right? Like we, in our staff dynamics, we value clear boundaries. We value hard work, but we also value fun.
Yep.
Like I want people to feel a certain pressure to get the job done, but then I also want to alleviate that pressure by them knowing this is a fun place. We're joking around. We're lighthearted. We love having a good laugh. You create a certain culture that is conducive to ministerial success. And the same principle applies to your family.
Yep.
Right?
100%.
All right. So earlier on, you kind of raised the issue of, I'm not sure if you use the word like social awkwardness or something like that.
Yes.
And I want to come back to that because I put a note in my notes to address that. So I want to talk about like the whole dynamic of protecting and sheltering. So we are called to protect our children, obviously from death. We want to keep them alive. Like, no, don't run across the street. Don't go near that rabid dog. Don't stick your finger in an outlet. We want to protect our children physically from an unnecessarily early death, although children still die, sadly, but we want to protect them from that. And then we want to protect our kids from unnecessary exposure to moral evil. And so obviously you be careful who you allow to babysit your kids. By the way, teenage boys should never be invited to babysit girls. They just shouldn't. They're at a stage in life where their hormones are dangerously out of control, and you could have 10 great boys that would do nothing, but then one that struggles and molests a child or something. So don't allow teenage boys to babysit, especially girls. And then we're protecting our kids from kids that blaspheme or swear. Maybe we protect our kids from maybe being exposed early on to aberrant marriages, allowing their kids to go to someone's house where there's a divorce taking place or some sort of a same-sex marriage thingamabob going on or whatever. So we protect our kids from that. We're careful. Sleepovers, we're always we should always be conscious about where the kids are allowed to sleep over. And you don't need your kids to be afraid of being sexually molested or trafficked, but it happens, right? So you say to them, like, if you're sleeping over at someone's house, and I don't want you to put weird ideas in your mind about Mr. such and such or Mrs. such and such or their sons or whatever, but you defend yourself from sexual assault. You don't stay quiet. If someone ever touches you, you immediately tell me, and we will call the police. You don't hide that. There's no secrecy, but at the same time, you don't create an environment where the kid's looking over their shoulder thinking they're going to be molested any moment, right? So you protect your kid from sexual assault.
Yeah.
So the point is there's all sorts of protections we put in place, but when it comes to raising our kids in the fear and admonition of the Lord, like whether you choose to school and educate your children at home. First of all, like it might sound kind of weird for people to hear this, but like education in mathematics or science or literature is not a biblical requirement. Okay. Now it's kind of unimaginable that you could go very far in life without those skill sets. But do you think Adam and Eve were educating their children in literature? There was none. Do you think they were educating them in mathematical equations? They didn't exist. So as human beings have learned things over the years, we've put it into curriculum, and for your kid to function in a culture, I would highly advise you to educate them in literature, in language, in mathematics and science and all these classical subjects. These are really, really important, as well as the practical. Like if your kid can't sew a button on, why? If your kid doesn't know how to change a spark plug, why? Like at some point, they're probably going to have to do that or hire someone to do it. So the basic things. But the most important thing is to obviously educate them in the Word of God, which touches on and intersects with all of these other subjects as well. that we have developed over time. So whether you are feeling capable and competent to do all of that work in your home environment with your kids to put them through what we would call elementary school and high school, or whether you're like, I can handle the elementary stuff, but some of those high school subjects I'm going to, connect with a good Christian school, or whether they're in Christian school the whole time or whatever, we don't want to stigmatize people. Like, I don't want people to feel, well, we're homeschoolers, so we're lesser than, or we're homeschooled, so we're more spiritual, or we're classical academy people, or we're Christian academy people, or whatever, right? And I also don't really want to stigmatize people that put their kid in the public schools. I just think that the public schools in our context are so bad, they're so woefully bad, that you're probably creating unnecessary potential for destruction in your children's lives. And I just advise against it, right? But it's not like, oh, you can't come to our church if you don't send your kid to our school, or, we stigmatize. People can be hypersensitive and think that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Like, if I don't educate my kid in the same way that Pastor Chris Eelman does, he's not going to maybe think of me for leadership opportunities in the church. Right. Or, if Pastor Aaron doesn't agree with sending my kid to a public school, maybe I got to go to another church. And I'm not saying that, but I'm a truth teller. And I'm just going to tell you that if you're putting your kids in a public school, you're putting them in the lion's den. And they're going to get bit eventually. Now, fortunately, the Spirit of the Lord is there, and he can also protect them like he protected Daniel, but don't assume it, right?
Daniel wasn't climbing in there willfully.
Yeah. So, but where I would just want to speak, hopefully gently, hopefully this is received well, is that, in the life of the church, there are some people that struggle a little bit more in relationships. They don't always understand what to say in the moment. They might feel a little bit shy or reserved or out of place, or lacking friendships, unable to connect with people. And that may be a result of their parentage, whatever. But if that's you, then you need to think about the fact that most of our strengths and weaknesses are exaggerated in the next generation. And if you struggle in social relationships and you're like, well, I struggled at school, I always felt like out of place at school, so I'm going to keep my kid at home because I don't want them to feel that way. Well, they're going to pick up on that. And you might actually create a child that's even less likely and less able to socialize. So I don't want to stigmatize or stereotype, but stereotypes exist for a reason. And you are more likely to have a child that's not particularly socially well adjusted if you just homeschool them and you don't expose them to, let's say, homeschooling networks, or they're not involved in a youth group or whatever, or if it's because you say you're homeschooling them because you want to protect them from the world, but really you just don't want them to feel awkward like you did, right? So I remember when I was in school, not so much in later high school, but I think there was a period of time, maybe from about grade 5 or 6 to, I would say, maybe grade 10, where I felt socially awkward. And part of it was because that was the period of time when my dad had left and my parents broke down and we moved around all the time. And we're constantly moving houses and you never really got settled in. And I didn't have an older brother. I had an older sister, but she was kind of off the rails at the time. And I didn't have a lot of mentors. I wasn't really part of a good youth group. And I struggled with knowing, like, how do you act at school? And so I can understand that. Like, it can be kind of awkward. And we were very, very poor. Like, I was always embarrassed because my lunch bag was, like, empty, right? So to eat in a cafe would be unheard of because, the other kids would see you got nothing in your lunch practically. And so there's dynamics like that people wrestle with circumstantially. But I was always around people. And so it helped me to work through that. And I think the worst thing my mom could have done for me at the time would be to homeschool me. That would have exacerbated those problems instead of corrected them. So protect your kids, but don't think you can shelter them from all harms, and make sure that you're not protecting them because really it's just your own insecurity. Now, if you've ever owned a domestic cat or a domestic dog, and then you've seen maybe a wild cat or a wild dog, Yeah, it's like the same species, but there's something different in their eyes. Like a domesticated cat is essentially a socialized cat. A domesticated dog is a socialized dog, but a dog that is living feral, a cat there's like a wildness. There's like an inability to relate. They just run or they just fight or whatever. I remember years ago, I went outside and I was shocked to see this. This was at our last house. We had some ducks and rabbits, maybe it was at the time. And I saw this gray cat come just like a bullet. It came out of the rabbit box and just went across the lot. I'd never seen a cat move that fast. And I looked in there and it had slaughtered, I think a couple rabbits and ducks, if I remember at the time, dashed under our porch. And I don't think like a domestic cat would act like that, but this thing was literally like wild. Like it was like a little cheetah.
Yeah.
And I eventually trapped it and drove several miles down the road and let it off in front of a field or something. And even when it came out of the cage, it was just like a bat out of hell, right? I'm like, this is not someone's cat. Like this is clearly a wild cat. And you can kind of see that in kids. You can see a child that will look you in the eyes, that will study you, that will relate to you and interact with you, as opposed to a kid that's wild. They're untamed. They're looking all different directions. They don't know how to respond to you. They don't know how to carry out a conversation. That's the difference between bad parenting and good parenting in relationship to what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. And so the more you expose your kids to relationships with healthy people, and if they're exposed to sin, you talk through it, the better, the more socialized of a child you're going to be. And that child is going to have the capacity to carry on more relationships than the child that's been hyper sheltered. And if you're like, well, I don't even know if my kids are like that. Well, watch how other people relate to them. If other people tend to be a little put off by your kids. Now, I think a lot of adults don't pay enough attention to kids in the church. People tend to pay attention to their own age group. But, you also have adults that do pay attention to kids. And if everyone kind of looks at your kids and you see a little bit of a rolling of the eyes or a little bit of that was a strange child, then maybe that's going to tip you off. You need to make some adjustments in that regard.
Yeah, fair enough.
Or just ask someone in your small group, like off the record, hey, would you mind like honestly assessing us? Like, what do you think about the behavior of our children?
That's so hard. It's so hard.
Do it. It'll be fun.
I remember getting a report card back from one of our teachers, and I was like, oh, this is hard to read as a parent. Like it wasn't all glowing reviews of awesomeness, right? There's, and I appreciate it, but it is hard. But wounds from a friend can be trusted, right?
Yeah.
It's actually for the good in the end. So that's good. Okay, maybe we should shift gears and talk about adult children. Or do you have any further points you want to?
Yeah, I want to touch on a couple more things. I know we're moving along here, but catechizing them or indoctrinating them young in Christian theology and Christian doctrine and Christian beliefs is fundamental. And it needs to come from your mouth, whether that's in family devotions or conversations in the car or post-sermon chats on the way home or post-Sunday school chats on the way home. Make sure that you are talking theology with your kid, talking Christian ethics, unpacking and digesting and analyzing what they're seeing in the world around them. Finally, second from last, I've said this before, you're raising adults, not kids. So you're not raising someone that's going to be your perpetual mama's boy. You're raising an adult son. And you have 18 years to do that. Mm-hmm. And when that kid gets to 18, notwithstanding a child with maybe some disabilities, you need to have a fully functioning adult on your hands. So someone who can carry on relationships, someone that's capable of marriage, someone that's capable of handling their finances, someone that's standing on their own 2 feet spiritually, someone that's completed their secondary education, someone that can drive, someone that manages their own affairs, that can make their own decisions. You need to do that. You have 18 years, not 20, not 28, not 32, 18. Mm-hmm. That's your job. Get it done. And also, I'd just say, especially in the younger years, predictable patterns and routines. I wasn't very good at this because I wasn't raised this way. Susie helped me with this. But when you're home, you're eating dinner at the dinner table, not on TV trays around the boob tube, not in front of the internet. You eat dinner at the table with your family all at once. Make that a pattern in your house. clean off the dinner table, get all the junk off of it that's maybe piled up there, and eat dinner together. Make that a pattern. Expectations in terms of vacations. That's vacations aren't like somehow biblically necessary, but most people take them. So saying, camping every year, that's something we did for years. Kids love that, or cottaging every year. Those kind of patterns or routines. Later on, we did this thing where one year we'd buy Christmas presents, the next year we'd take them on a trip. And they look forward to that. Those are some of our best memories. So patterns, routines, kids thrive on that. Expectations, not down to every little tiny nitty-gritty detail, but having patterns and routines in a family, expectations, annual events, annual trips are a blessing. And to a greater degree than I probably would have assumed in a home where that wasn't emphasized, I really appreciate the fact that my wife brought that dynamic into our marriage, and then we kind of added our own. Having those patterns of behavior where there's times when we're together, even now at our home Saturday night, unless there's a wedding or something, all of our kids are always welcome to come. They can't always make it, but they're always welcome to come. We always have dinner together as a clan. And that's a good point of connection for us.
Yeah, real good. Okay, transitioning to adulthood, because you have adult children now.
I'm just trying to figure that out still.
You're still trying to figure
Yeah.
Our children will reach adulthood, Lord willing. What are you learning about that could help others?
Yeah, so I guess I'm 8 years into that. Because my oldest is 26 this summer. So some things that I'm learning, I think the one thing I would say to parents is like prepare yourself mentally and emotionally for that in advance, and then just be okay with it. Because there is a certain excitement that comes with, the kid's going to their prom, or the kid's graduating, or they're going off to college. And there's a certain that kind of went by a little fast. I'm going to miss them. So you need to prepare yourself emotionally for that. And hopefully your child reaching adulthood is not like, I can get them out of my hair now. But it's more like, that went by fast. But I'm okay with that. I'm okay with the fact that life is short and I'm releasing them into the adult world. I think if you don't prepare yourself for that, you will stunt the growth of your child and maybe frustrate that process. It'll be harder on you than you think. And you might be tempted to try to control them or mother them or father them or parent them up close and personally too long. So I would say there's a difference between parenting a child up to adulthood and just being a parent when they're an adult. But I'm not parenting my children anymore. I'm their parent, but I'm not parenting them.
Yes.
Like in the sense of getting them to adulthood.
Waking them up.
Calling them, making sure they're out of bed. One thing I think is important for adult kids is to do regular check-ins, because they can easily drift. I've noticed with my boys when they first moved out, there was a year or two where I got the vibe they didn't really want to hang out with me too much. But then a year or two goes by and, absence makes the heart grow fonder, and then there's sort of a reconnection. So my girls, I didn't experience that because girls are different. But I would say that one of our children lives out of the area, and 3 of them live outside the house. So being consistent, every week or every 2 weeks or whatever it is, pick up the phone and make a call. And they're very good at that as well. So just having that point of contact to maintain that relationship into those adult years, I think is important. When you want to give your kids advice and they're minors and they're under their house, there doesn't need to be any lead time. It's like, hey, I noticed this. Here's what I want you to do. But with adult children, I think you should probably wait until you've seen the same thing 2 or 3 or 4 times, and then maybe even delay a little bit more. So any advice you're going to give to adult children should have a huge delay in front of it. Often it resolves itself, and it needs to be very selective. Is this actually something I want to talk to my son or daughter about? And I would say I would probably maybe communicate a concern to one of my adult children that are now, have gone through the whole leaving and cleaving process. I mean, I don't want to quantify it, but probably not much more than once a year per child. And sometimes there's maybe something they do or say or buy, or, I'm like, I'm not sure that's the greatest decision. But I just zip it, because I don't want to helicopter parent them. I want them to be treated as adults. I want them to be given freedom. But if I had a little concern, I might say, hey, I've just been thinking about you, bro, or my daughter, I'm thinking about you, hon, and I want to kind of maybe throw something out for you to consider. I circle and I'm very careful not to be, not to give them an imperative, but to speak in subjunctives. This may be true, you might want to consider this, but not like this is what you need to do or this is what you. So I want to speak to them as a sage, like as a wise counselor, rather than as someone that's like somehow telling them what they have to do. So financially, this is important too. So our view is that, we are financially responsible for our children up till they're adults, but along the way, we're encouraging them to work. That's part of their education. You get a better adult if they've had a part-time job in their teen years and they've paid their own cell phone bill. Parents, you're not paying your kids' cell phone bills. Did you hear me? You're not paying your kids' cell phone bills. You're not paying their car insurance. Did you hear me? Oh, but they need a car. Do not pay their car insurance. Okay. Toss my advice aside to your own peril. Okay. When they have a job, charge them rent. Oh, but we don't need the money. Fine. Sock it away for them for later. Charge them rent. Okay. They're adults. Like, charge them rent. If you're an adult child living in the home, shame on you if you haven't offered to pay your parents rent. Okay. Shame on you. Okay. You're not acting like an adult. You're acting like a child. So we are responsible for our kids up to adulthood. But once they hit adulthood, there's no expectation. Every dollar you might give them for tuition, for a down payment, for a car, that's all a gift. That's all without expectation. Do not promise your children to pay for anything after the age of 18. And again, that starts before with those unnecessary expenses. If you want a cell phone, get a job. You want to drive the car around, it's going to cost another $150 a month or whatever, get a job. You get a better kid out of it. Okay. I know believe it or not, there's a soft tenderheartedness to me that sometimes I have to put the principle in front of what I want to do, because I'm like, I just want to help them a little bit more. Like, I just have to step back and say that's not a good idea. Let the principles drive, not the emotions. And parents need to be on the same page in this regard, because sometimes mom's pulling in a different direction than dad. So we, especially with all the garbage going on in society, Susie and I have had the opportunity to help our kids quite a bit in their adult years with different purchases or bills or whatever, but never with any expectations attached. And I don't have any expectations of them. Right. I don't, if I give you money toward a house or a car or whatever, or a wedding or whatever it might be, like, it's not like, well, then you got to show up 3 times a week. Right. Or, yes. I need to be able to babysit the grandkids twice a month. No, I'm not going to be that guy. There's no like, I'm going to scratch your back if you scratch mine. There's no strings attached either way. And that's the kind of relationship you want. It's also cool to let them serve you too. So, we've been invited to one of our children's homes tonight for dinner. It's going to be cool. They're going to make us dinner. And I'm looking forward to that. Let them serve you too. It's not always we go to mom and dad's for supper. They're going to invite us over to their home for dinner. Let them serve you. Guide them, but don't control their spousal choices. Totally veto it if it's an unbeliever. Yep. But you want to guide them in their spousal choices. So I remember an older couple said to me when I was younger, they said, our kids married people and we love all of our daughter or son-in-laws, whatever they had, but we wouldn't have anticipated in advance, that's the person they're going to marry. That's the person they're going to marry. And I found that too, like in hindsight, I'm like, these relationships make sense. Like they're compatible, but they weren't really on my radar. Like it wasn't just something it's hard to know, it's hard to envision like who your kid's going to marry. And so they're different than you too, right? Yep. And sometimes I'm thinking of a mother many years ago that was so controlling. When I was a youth pastor, she was so controlling over like every dating relationship, every person her son was around, that he just couldn't find a spouse. He ended up staying single. And I think he was a marryable guy, but his mother was so controlling. The controlling mother can be so destructive. The absentee father can be destructive, but controlling mothers that control their sons or treat their sons or daughters like surrogate spouses, it creates a very sick, weird dynamic. And there's freedom just to releasing them. when grandkids come and we're just kind of getting into that, like, I just love these kids to death. Like it's a really cool thing, but I need to be reminded they're not my kids, right? They're my grandchildren. I want to help. I want to assist. I'm going to be there for them. If they're dropped off and I'm the guy taking care of them, like I'm going to be awesome grandpa, number one, but they're not my kids. So help to raise, you can help to raise your grandkids, but don't raise them for your children. You're just ripping them off, and they shouldn't be overly reliant upon you or expect that, it's all going to be free babysitting and you can drop them off anytime. Of course it is free babysitting, but I would never want my kids to assume that that's just like some expectation of us. And then finally, Chris, sit back and enjoy the fruit of your labor. So it is fun just to be able to sit back and see, hey, the kids have made it. They love Christ. They have jobs and, they're doing well. And it's enjoyable just to watch and observe them now establish their own households and move forward.
That's great. Yeah. Oh, that's really, really good. I'm looking forward to that stage. Okay, before we go, we have a listener question that came in last week regarding, I don't know if it was tied necessarily to the husband-wife thing, but it was a question about divorce. And so I wanted to throw that at you. The question essentially is, if a person was divorced prior to becoming a believer, can they get remarried? And so you might want to add some nuance to that the possibilities. But that in brief is the question.
Well, I would say it's like 99% common for churches to teach that. It's just not found in the Bible. There's no laws for unbelievers and laws for believers when it comes to marriage and divorce. The Bible doesn't differentiate between the two. But I would have been raised being told that if you divorced your spouse before you were saved, in other words, you didn't know better, then you're free and clear to remarry anybody under whatever circumstances. So if I back up the train, I would say there are grounds for divorce and remarriage. And those grounds, I would put them into 3 buckets. The one is if the unbelieving spouse abandons you, 1 Corinthians 7, you're not bound to that. You should never initiate that divorce, that separation. But if you're not bound, the passage isn't speaking specifically about remarriage, but it's implying you're not bound. You're not in that covenant. Yeah. You're not under that covenant anymore. So let's just say you're unbelieving. You become a Christian. Your spouse says, I don't want anything to do with this. And you do everything you can to sanctify them and to lead them to Christ. And they're like, I'm out of here. Well, you're not bound to that relationship. You're not at fault for it. Secondly, in the case of porneia, which is sexual immorality, if your spouse commits adultery on you, they run off on you, whatever, they violate their marriage covenant sexually, you are not bound to stay single. So if you are the offended party, you can, under the right circumstances, obviously it has to be a believer and whatnot, you can remarry. The third is based upon the broader ethics of Scripture. If your husband's trying to murder you, if your husband is molesting your children, if your husband is committing a criminal act that makes it impossible and unethical for you to stay in that union, I would never counsel someone and say, well, then you can't remarry. But if you are the person that's done the offending, you have 2 options. Well, you have 3 options, but there's only 2 good options.
Yeah.
One is to repent and stay single, or the second is to repent and reconcile. But you don't have the option of repenting and remarrying. Okay? And unfortunately, we have pulled the cork out of the bottle in our culture. And there are numerous Christians that think, you know what? Okay, I had an affair on my wife. Their marriage broke down. A little bit of time went off. I repented. You're always going to find some pastor out there that will say, that's okay. You've repented. And we'll remarry you. And then those people shuffle from church to church to church, and you inherit all these messy situations based upon advice they've received from other clergymen in the past that may or not be biblical. So I don't spend all my time policing people's stories. Like if they've been remarried before they came to our church, years have gone by, and the egg's been well scrambled. I don't spend my time unscrambling all those eggs, and assessing and analyzing every person's situation.
Yeah.
No. There's conversations that take place, but there's so many dynamics and so many situations like that. You'd have to have 3 guys full-time on staff just to do that. But we preach the principles from the pulpit. And if conviction is brought into someone's life and they realize I'm in an illegitimate marriage, they need to end that. Now, people rarely hear that as well. Say, does God ever sanction divorce? Oh, no, never. Yeah, he does. In Ezra 10, verse 3, when the Jewish men came back from Babylon and they were illegitimately married to pagan wives, who, by the way, had the time to convert by then, he said, put them away, divorce them. Mm-hmm. So I would go as far as to say that let's say, to use a common example, let's say you abandon your spouse for another person. So you're Christian or not, you leave your spouse, you go have an affair with somebody else. And then you remarry, you then marry that person. And that is not a legitimate marriage. You need to end that marriage. Now, you hardly ever hear that spoken. And I think probably for the majority of our listeners, that will shock them. Mm-hmm. But I'll tell you this, that's why we're losing the same-sex marriage battle. That's why we've lost it in our culture. Because heterosexuals are like, well, we can always find some way for heterosexuals to remarry. Well, there's always some, well, I repented, or well, I was under emotional abuse, or I was struggling from mental illness, which is the new excuse for every sin. Or, I wasn't saved at the time. You were married. You were married under God, whether you acknowledged him or not, and you have a responsibility to reconcile with your spouse or remain single. Now, the sad thing is that it's going to be a long time before we win this battle, because most Christians will not honor it. Even in my own ministry, I know Christians that I've passed over the years that will just go to attend a relative's wedding, even though they're remarrying after they've committed an affair. They've had an affair, they've committed adultery, because they don't want to mess with the relationship, right? Yep. And so the sad thing is you can be a Christian who's remarried, who has an Ontario marriage license, and maybe has even had some pastor sign off on it, and you current tense are committing adultery. Mm-hmm. That's how else do you read Matthew 18? Yep. If you divorce your wife other than for porneia, for sexual immorality, and she marries another, so in marriage, you cause her to commit adultery. So you can be committing adultery while you're married with the person you're married to if it's not a legitimate marriage. So we need to green light legitimate opportunities that people have for remarriage, but we need to stop this nonsensical teaching in our churches that says there's always a way, there's always a means for us to find some loophole for people to remarry. There needs to be times in every pastor, and it's not like the pastor's job is to police all this stuff. The congregation needs to do their job too, because you're probably going to be talked to first, to say, no, you do not have the right to remarry. And it's not the end of the world. Like, there's all kinds of single people in our church that have never married. How shameful if married people have this notion, well, we always have the right to remarry, but the single people, they should just stay single, right? Mm-hmm. So that's my belief on it. I think it's grounded in Scripture. Again, we can't unscramble all the messy situations that we've inherited. If someone's been married to someone illegitimately for decades and decades and decades, and they've repented of it, and I don't even know what to say about that. I guess that's between you and the Lord, but I'm not comfortable with saying that that's a legitimate marriage. And you need to really think through the issues to see if it's a legitimate marriage. Now, if your spouse abandoned you, you ran off or they ran off on you, then yeah, you're green lighted. Mm-hmm. But let's not make light of this. This is a significant relationship. It's the creational relationship. It's a covenantal relationship. And we need to hold it in high regard. And we need to say to young people, like, when you stand before God and you enter into covenant, I don't even care if you do vows or not. The Bible doesn't say you have to do vows to be married. When you stand in public and make a public covenant before God, whether you do vows or tie ropes around your hands or exchange rings or whatever symbolism you choose to include, you are in a covenant. And that covenant is for life. And you need to be faithful to that covenant. God will sanctify you through that covenant. And if you violate that covenant, you need to repent and re-enter the covenant, or you need to stay single, but not start entering into all these other false covenants, thinking that somehow that's going to satisfy you or bring God's approval. Yeah. And what the government says really doesn't even matter anymore, The government will marry pretty much anything that moves. So we need to have a Christian creational view of marriage, and that creational view of marriage also applies to pagans. Okay,
Yep.
so pagans are also under God's creational design for marriage.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Well, thanks to that listener for sending in the question. Hopefully that answer has been helpful in addressing it. We want to remind all our listeners that you can send and submit questions on our Beachhead Media app. Hopefully you've downloaded that by now. I know we've reworked it a little bit and hopefully been made even more useful. But if you hit questions on there, you can submit a question and we'll try to address it in future shows. So thanks, Aaron, for today. Thanks for our listeners for tuning in. And we hope you'll tune in next week to another episode of Leadership Now with Dr. Aaron Rock.